The night had settled like a heavy blanket over the mountains, the kind of night when even the wolves didn't bother to howl. Daniel sat alone in his cabin, the crackle of the fire the only sound besides the groan of the wind outside. Snow pressed hard against the shutters, and he knew by morning it would be piled waist-high. Winters in the high country were cruel, but he had chosen this solitude. A man who wanted peace learned to accept the silence, the cold, and the aching loneliness. He had just settled back in his chair, boots drying near the hearth, when it came a sound so out of place that at first he thought it was a trick of the wind, a knock, not once, but twice. Sharp, frantic, almost swallowed by the storm, Daniel froze. Nobody came this far into the mountains without reason, especially not in the dead of winter. He rose slowly, his hand brushing against the rifle leaning near the door, habit born of long nights alone. The knock came again, weaker this time, as though the one on the other side was losing strength. He unbarred the door and pulled it open. Against the shrieking wind, snow whipped inside in a white fury, stinging his face. And there, barely standing, was a young woman wrapped in a worn fur blanket. Her dark hair, matted with ice, framed a face pale from cold but strikingly alive, her eyes wide with desperation. She looked no more than 20. Please. Her voice was little more than a whisper, nearly carried off by the wind. Warmth. Daniel didn't hesitate. He reached out, grasped her arm, and pulled her inside before the storm swallowed her whole. She stumbled, her knees giving way as she collapsed onto the wooden floor just inside the door. Quickly, he shoved the door closed again, barring it. Against the howling dark, for a moment, he just looked at her. An Apache girl, that much was clear. Her features bore the proud sharpness of her people, but her lips were blue from the cold. He crouched down, pulled the blanket from her shoulders, and wrapped her instead in one of his heavy woolen quilts. Easy now, he said softly, though he doubted she understood much English. Still, tone mattered. He coaxed her closer to the fire, lifting her gently and setting her down on the rug before the hearth. The warmth licked at her frozen skin, and she shivered violently, teeth chattering as life tried to return to her limbs. Daniel fetched the pot of stew simmering over the coals and poured a bowl, pressing it into her trembling hands. She tried to lift the spoon, but her fingers were too stiff, so he guided her hand, steadying it until she managed a bite. Slowly, color began to return to her cheeks. When her eyes met his, they held both gratitude and wariness. She did not thank him in words, but he saw it in the way she studied him, as though trying to decide if this stranger was salvation or danger. "What's your name?" Daniel asked quietly. She hesitated, then spoke through the stiffness in her lips. "Ahiona," he nodded. "I'm Daniel." The storm raged outside, rattling the shutters as though the night itself tried to claw its way in. But here, in the glow of the fire, there was an island of warmth, fragile but real. Daniel sat back in his chair, keeping his eyes on the girl huddled under the quilt. She ate in silence, cautious, her gaze flicking often toward the door as if fearful of pursuit. Questions stirred in him. Why had she been alone in a storm like this? Where were her people? What had driven her to knock on the cabin of a stranger one who should have been her enemy, if old hatred still lingered? Yet none of that mattered now. She was alive because she had found her way to his door. And as he watched her, her breath slowly evening out, he realized that something had shifted in the stillness of his lonely life. For the first time in many winters, Daniel was not alone. Morning light crept reluctantly through the frost-rimmed window panes, spilling pale streaks across the cabin's rough-hewn floor. The storm had quieted, though snow still blanketed the mountains outside in a deep, suffocating silence. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, filling the single-room cabin with a faint orange glow. Daniel stirred from his cot at the sound of movement. The Apache girl, Ahiona, she had named herself the night before, was no longer huddled in the quilt before the hearth. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the rug, turning her hands over the flames as though still trying to chase the cold from her bones. Her dark hair, once stiff with ice, now fell damp and heavy down her back. Warmed by the fire's heat, Daniel rose, pulling on his boots. He noticed how she tensed at his movement, her eyes flashing to him with the alertness of someone who had spent her life learning not to trust too quickly. He slowed, lowering his voice. "You're safe here," he said. "Storm's past." She tilted her head as though catching the tone more than the words. There was understanding there, but partial, like she grasped fragments of English without holding the whole. Still, her shoulders eased slightly, and Daniel took that as a small victory. He busied himself at the table, slicing bread and ladling out another bowl of stew. When he set it before her, she hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, bowing her head just slightly in acknowledgement. The simple gesture struck him with unexpected weight. As she ate, Daniel studied her more closely in the firelight. She was younger than he had thought, her features delicate but resolute, her posture carrying a quiet dignity even in exhaustion. The furs she had arrived in were torn, as though she had traveled hard. He could see faint scratches along her wrists and a bruise darkening near her collarbone. Whatever her journey had been, it had not been gentle. When the food was gone, she touched her chest lightly and spoke again. "Ahiona." Daniel nodded. "Ahiona," he pointed to himself. "Daniel." A flicker of a smile touched her lips. Brief but real. Then she spoke more words, slower this time, as though searching for the right ones. Far, lost." She pressed her hand outward, mimicking distance, then wrapped her arms around herself as though shivering. "Snow, cold." He pieced the meaning together. She had been separated from her people, caught in the storm. Perhaps she had wandered for days before finding his cabin. He wondered if they were searching for her now or if she had been fleeing. Something more than weather. "You can stay until it's safe," Daniel said gently. He wasn't sure how much she understood, but he hoped the steadiness in his tone carried the meaning. For the rest of the morning, silence stretched between them, but not an uncomfortable one. Daniel mended a harness at the table, his hands moving with practiced ease, while Ahiona explored the cabin with quiet curiosity. She touched the iron kettle, the carved wooden figures on the shelf, the old rifle hanging on the wall, objects that seemed foreign to her. When her eyes fell on his mother's Bible lying on the mantel, she reached toward it but did not touch. As though sensing it held meaning she could not enter. By afternoon, the snow outside glittered under a hesitant sun. Daniel stepped out too. Fetch more firewood, leaving the door ajar. Ahiona followed to the threshold, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. She looked out at the endless white world, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she appeared small against the vastness of the mountains, like a figure caught between two worlds, hers and his. That night, she curled up once more near the hearth, refusing the cot Daniel offered. He watched her as sleep claimed her, the firelight painting soft shadows across her face. She was a stranger, yet her presence shifted the cabin's silence into something new, something warmer. Though unspoken, Daniel lay awake longer than usual, listening to the rhythm of her breathing mingle with the crackle of the fire. For the first time in years, the loneliness of winter felt different. The cabin was no longer just his. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm, a fragile balance between silence and observation. The storm outside had eased, but the snow lay deep across the mountains, making travel nearly impossible. The cabin became their world, and within its walls two strangers lived side by side, cautious of each other, bound together by necessity. Daniel had spent years alone in this wilderness, so he thought himself used to quiet. Yet now the silence felt different. He was not truly alone anymore, and every small sound, the scrape of Ahina's footsteps across the floorboards, the soft hum she sometimes made while tending the fire, seemed to echo louder than the wind itself. She was careful in her movements, always watchful. When he spoke, she listened with sharp eyes, as though weighing not only the words but the man behind them. Daniel, too, studied her. He noticed how she sat near the fire with her knees drawn close, how she glanced at the door, often as though expecting someone or something to come for her. Despite her quiet, she did not act helpless. When Daniel split logs out back, he caught her gathering kindling with efficient hands. When he offered to cook, she shook her head, moving to the pot herself and adding herbs from a small pouch she carried. The stew she prepared was richer, fuller, carrying flavors Daniel had never tasted. He realized then that though she was young, Ahina had been taught to take care of herself, but trust did not come easily. One evening, as the firelight flickered low, Daniel laid his rifle across the table to clean it. He noticed Ahina stiffen, her eyes fixed on the weapon, her body tightening as though she expected him to use it on her. Slowly, carefully, Daniel set the rifle aside and held up both hands. "No harm," he said quietly. "Not for you." She blinked, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, her shoulders lowered just slightly, and she turned her gaze back to the fire. Daniel realized then how deep the gulf between them ran. To her people, white men with rifles were not saviors, they were threats. That night, sleep came slow to him. He lay on his cot, watching the fire burn low and Ahina's form curled beneath the quilt. He thought of the way her eyes had flared with alarm, and he wondered if she would ever see him as anything other than danger. The following morning brought a small change. Daniel rose early to check his snares, leaving her alone in the cabin. When he returned hours later with 2 rabbits, he expected her to still be by the fire. Instead, he found her outside, footprints trailing from the door to the woodpile. She was stacking logs, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her hands red but determined. He stopped, watching her a moment before speaking. "You don't have to do that." She turned, breath fogging in the air, and for the first time her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Help," she said simply, pointing to the wood. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. It wasn't much, not a flood of words or declarations, but it was a bridge. She wanted to contribute, to share the work, and that meant she was not merely surviving under his roof. She was beginning to choose to be here. That evening they ate together more easily. She tasted the rabbit stew and nodded in approval, and Daniel felt oddly proud. Conversation was still halting, broken between gestures and fragments of words, but it was enough to make the silence less heavy. Yet beneath it all, tension lingered, an invisible line neither dared to cross. She was a guest, perhaps even a burden by some measures, but Daniel couldn't deny the way her presence stirred something in him. She was not simply another wanderer in need of shelter. She was a flame in his quiet world, and he was beginning to wonder what it meant now that she had been placed in his care. As the wind howled faintly outside, and the fire popped in the hearth, Daniel caught himself glancing at her more than he should. And every time their eyes met, even for a fleeting second, he felt that strange pull, a mixture of caution, curiosity, and something warmer, something dangerous. By the end of the week, the worst of the storm had passed. The sun shone over the mountains, glittering across fields of snow that stretched like an endless sea. Daniel knew he would need to ride down to the valley soon for supplies. Flour and coffee were running low, and if the thaw came late, he would regret waiting. Ahina stood at the window as he saddled his horse, her dark eyes following every movement. She did not speak, but Daniel felt the weight of her gaze. Part of him wanted to tell her she could come, yet he hesitated. The valley. Folk were wary enough of him, a man who preferred the company of pine trees to neighbors. How would they react to an Apache girl stepping into their midst, wrapped in his coat? He rode alone, the snow crunching beneath his horse's hooves. By the time he reached the small trading post nestled near the creek, the few men gathered there were already talking in low tones. Their eyes followed him as he dismounted. "Storm treat you fair, Daniel?" One of them called, a wiry ranch hand named Miller. "Fair enough," Daniel replied. He stepped inside, filled his sack with what he needed, and paid with a nod. He could feel the stares even with his back turned. It wasn't until he was tying the grain to his saddle that he caught the first whisper. "Word is, he's keeping an Apache girl up in that cabin of his." The voice was low, but it carried. Another man chuckled. "That true, Daniel? You got yourself a wild one to keep you warm through winter?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She was half dead in the snow. I gave her shelter, nothing more." Miller raised an eyebrow, smirking. "That so? Careful, friend. Her kind's got their own ways. You save a girl's life like that, she won't just walk away." "Not by their law." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The older man leaning against the post answered instead. His voice was grave, carrying the weight of old tailies. "Among the Apache, a man who gives a woman shelter in her time of need, who saves her from death, he's bound to her. She's his and he's hers, husband and wife by their tradition. You reckon she don't already know that?" The words landed heavier than Daniel expected. He tried to laugh them off, but unease stirred in him. He thought of Ahiana's quiet presence by the fire, the way she had begun to share the work of the cabin as though it belonged to her. Had she come to believe she was already his wife? The men around him kept talking, some with amusement, others with suspicion. "Don't bring trouble down on yourself," Miller warned. "Folks around here don't take kindly to mixing blood. You do best to send her back to her people before spring." Daniel mounted his horse without replying. He rode back through the snow with the whispers still circling in his head like vultures. When the cabin came into sight, smoke curling from the chimney, he felt an odd pull in his chest. Inside, Ahiona was crouched by the hearth, tending the fire as though she had always belonged there. She looked up when he entered, her lips curving into the faintest smile of relief at his return. Daniel set the supplies down, but his mind was elsewhere. Was this what the valley men had spoken of? Was this her people's tradition binding her to him because of one night's shelter? And if it was, did she want it? Or was she trapped by a custom she could not escape? That night, as he lay on his cot staring at the rafters, Daniel wrestled with the weight of the rumor. He had offered warmth, nothing more. But the firelight flickering over Ayana's sleeping face told him plainly, life in the mountains was no longer so simple. The snow began to soften with the days that followed, loosening its grip on the pines and the creek beds. The world outside the cabin was stirring again, though slowly. Daniel spent the mornings clearing paths and checking snares, while Ahiona busied herself inside, turning the small space into something that felt less like a shelter and more like a home. She swept the floor with a bundle of sage branches, strung dried herbs above the hearth, and even mended a tear in his coat without being asked. To Daniel, it was unsettling in ways he couldn't quite name. Each small act tied her presence more tightly into his life until he caught himself wondering what the place would feel like if she were suddenly gone. It was during one such morning that riders appeared. Daniel spotted them first while chopping wood, 4 figures moving across the snow at the tree line. Their ponies were lean and sure-footed, their riders wrapped in furs. He knew them instantly, Apache. Ahana saw them too. She stepped out to the threshold, her body stiffening, her gaze fixed on the riders as though bracing herself. The men dismounted at the edge of the clearing. One, older than the rest, spoke in their tongue. Ahiona answered quickly, her voice low but steady. Daniel couldn't make sense of the words, but he caught the way her chin lifted with pride, the way the men's eyes shifted toward him with unreadable weight. At last, the elder addressed Daniel in broken English. "You, white man, you keep her in your house. Give her fire. Save her life." He paused, the silence heavy with meaning. "Now she is your woman." Daniel felt the words strike like an axe. "That's not what He stopped, forcing calm into his voice. "I didn't take her. I only gave her shelter." The elder's eyes narrowed. "Shelter is life. Life is bond. You cannot send her away now, not without shame, not without dishonor." Ahiona stood quiet beside him, her face unreadable. Daniel turned to her, searching for some hint of what she felt. Did she believe this too? Did she want this fate? He tried again. "She deserves a choice, not a chain made of tradition." The men murmured among themselves, but the elder raised his hand. "Our ways are older than your tongue. A woman saved is a wife given. If you cast her aside, you cast shame on her name. She will carry it like a stone forever." Daniel's jaw clenched. The unfairness of it burned in him. He had acted out of kindness, not intent. Yet kindness, by their law, had bound him tighter than rope. After a long moment, the elder turned to Ahiona, speaking words Daniel could not follow. She answered quietly, her voice neither protest nor acceptance, simply steady. The elder nodded, then gestured to his companions. They mounted their ponies again, leaving the clearing without another glance. When the sound of hooves faded into the forest, silence returned heavier than before. Daniel turned to Ahiona. "Is that what you want? To stay here because your people say you must?" She met his eyes, holding them longer than she ever had before. Slowly, she placed her hand over her heart, then over his chest, just for a second. No words came, but the gesture was enough to steal the breath from him. Daniel stepped back, conflicted. He could not deny the stir of something deeper in him, admiration for her strength, the warmth her presence brought, but he hated the idea of being bound by anything other than choice. And he hated more the thought that she might not truly be free in her own heart. That night, the fire crackled between them as it always did, but the silence was thick with unspoken questions. Was she there because she wanted to be, or because she was trapped by a tradition older than both of them? And what frightened Daniel most was the thought that deep down, part of him wanted her to stay, no matter the reason. The days after the writer's visit weighed heavy. Daniel felt it in every look Ahiona gave him, in every moment of silence that stretched too long. It wasn't the quiet of two strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people caught in a question neither dared to speak aloud. Daniel kept himself busy. He repaired fences along the lower pasture, checked the creek for signs of thaw, split wood until his arms ached. Yet no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't drive the thought from his mind. Was she staying by her will, or because of the chain of tradition her people had spoken of? Inside, Ahiona moved about the cabin with her usual grace, though something had shifted in her demeanor. She no longer glanced toward the door as often, no longer seemed restless to leave. She tidied the shelves, dried herbs above the hearth, and began humming soft songs in her tongue while she worked. Sometimes Daniel caught himself stopping just to listen, the low melody curling through the air like smoke. One evening, as he carved a new handle for his axe, he found her watching him. Her gaze wasn't wary, as it had been in the first days, nor was it distant. It was intent, steady, almost as if she were weighing something inside herself. When he finally looked up, she didn't look away. Daniel cleared his throat. "Ahiona, if you want to go back to your people, I'll see you safe there when the snow clears." She tilted her head, understanding enough to catch his meaning. Slowly she shook her head. "No." The firmness of that single word startled him. "No?" he echoed. She rose from her seat and came closer, kneeling by the fire between them. With deliberate care, she touched her hand to her chest, then extended it outward, as though offering something invisible. Then she touched her chest again, and finally rested her hand against the floorboards of the cabin. Daniel frowned, trying to follow the silent language. "Your heart? Here?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She nodded once. "Here." The word was soft but certain. For a moment, Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to believe it, that she wasn't bound by her people's law, but by her own choice, yet doubt lingered like a shadow. Could a few weeks in the cabin truly shape such a bond? Or was she only surrendering to the weight of what tradition demanded? That night, Ahana's actions spoke louder than her words. When Daniel offered her the cot again, she refused as always. But instead of curling up alone by the hearth, she spread her quilt closer to his cot, near enough that the warmth of their fireside places mingled. Daniel lay awake long into the night, the nearness of her presence stirring something restless inside him. Over the next days, her silent choice became clearer. She shared in his work without being asked, hauling water from the creek, repairing snares, even laughing once when his horse shook snow all over him. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a sound light and musical, and it startled him more than the storm had weeks ago. Still, she never pressed, never demanded. She simply remained present, steady, a quiet current flowing through his once lonely life. Daniel began to realize that her silence was not submission but strength. She wasn't bound by her people's tradition alone. She was choosing, in her own way, to stay. Whether it was for him, for the safety of the cabin, or for some deeper reason he didn't yet understand, he couldn't say. But the truth pressed on him more each day. He no longer wanted to imagine the cabin without her. One evening, as they shared a meal, their eyes met across the table. For a long moment neither looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, dangerous, and undeniably real. It wasn't tradition that bound them now. It was choice, hers. And Daniel was beginning to realize his own. Spring had not yet arrived, but the valley below the mountains was beginning to stir. Streams ran freer. Patches of green peeked through the melting snow, and the smell of thawing earth carried up to Daniel's cabin. For the first time in months, the world beyond the trees beckoned. Daniel had ridden into the valley a few days prior to trade for supplies. He had expected cautious curiosity, perhaps even polite smiles, but what he encountered instead unsettled him. Word had spread quickly. An Apache girl was living in his cabin. Some spoke in awe, others in suspicion. "You're playing with fire, Daniel," said a farmer as he passed. "Bringing her into your home like that, you'll stir trouble." Daniel had shrugged, trying to dismiss their concerns. But the words lingered, crawling into his thoughts like persistent frost. He had only sought to give shelter, yet now he felt the weight of a world that did not understand him, or Ahana. When he returned to the cabin, the tension had already begun. Ahana, tending the hearth as always, seemed aware of it. She paused in her work, her head tilting toward the door as though sensing the unease. Daniel noticed it immediately, her posture tense, her eyes alert. She was no stranger to suspicion, and she understood the world outside better than he did. That evening, voices rose from the valley. Men on horseback came up the slope, their shouts carrying through the thinning trees. Neighbors, traders, and even a few lawmen appeared, driven by curiosity and fear alike. "You've brought her here," one shouted. "Do you not see what you're doing? Mixing with their people dangerous. You'll bring shame." Daniel stepped forward, hands raised. "I offered her shelter, that's all." Another man barked a laugh. "Shelter, you say? Don't fool yourself. She's a stranger, and your cabin is no place for her or for you. You'll regret this." A hyena stepped beside Daniel silently, her presence a calm counterpoint to the rising storm of voices. Though she said nothing, the men noticed her stand steady, unflinching, the way a wildcat stands its ground. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, met each gaze, daring anyone to challenge her. Daniel realized then that it was not just her people's tradition that bound her, it was her strength, her courage, and her quiet authority. She would not be pushed aside, nor could she be dismissed as a mere victim of circumstance. Some murmured fearfully about mixed blood and dangerous alliances, while others shook their heads at Daniel, warning him of social censure. He felt the pressure of the valley weigh against the four walls of his cabin, the world beyond the trees encroaching on the fragile sanctuary he had built with fire and snow. But Daniel did not back down. "She's not just a guest," he said firmly. "She's here because she chooses to be, and I won't send her away." Ahana's hand brushed against his arm in silent support, a gesture that carried more power than any words could have. The crowd's tension did not break, but for a fleeting moment, Daniel felt a shift, not just in the way they saw him, but in the way he saw himself. He realized something crucial. The cabin, the fire, the winter, all of it had prepared him for this moment. He had thought he was alone in the mountains, isolated and free. But now he understood that true courage was not in solitude. True courage was standing beside someone, defending what mattered, and facing the world together. As the visitors muttered among themselves and finally rode back down the slope, Ahana remained by his side. She did not speak, but Daniel felt the affirmation in the quiet strength she exuded. Whatever the world might say, whatever traditions might demand, they were no longer strangers in the storm. The fire crackled between them that night with a warmth beyond wood and flame. Outside, the valley settled into silence again, but inside, Daniel felt a profound shift. He was no longer just a man defending a stranger. He was a man learning what it meant to fight for someone he had come to care for deeply. And Ahana, through her silent courage, had chosen him too. The valley's peace was fragile. Though the snow had mostly melted and the first shoots of green peeked through the thawing earth, danger lingered just beyond sight. Word had reached Daniel that a rival band of Apache raiders had been spotted near the northern ridges, known for attacking isolated homesteads. He knew the threat was real. He had lived long enough in the mountains to understand that the wilderness carried both beauty and peril. That evening, as the sky bled red with the last light of the sun, Daniel heard a faint cry in the distance. He froze, straining to listen. Ahana, who had been arranging firewood near the cabin, stiffened beside him. She whispered a single word in her language, sharp and urgent, and Daniel knew she understood danger before he even processed it. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for her to stay, but she stepped forward without hesitation. Her dark eyes met his, steady and unflinching. He saw no fear there, only resolve. "Stay here," he said again, more firmly this time. She shook her head, her lips pressing into a determined line. The gesture was silent, but the message was clear. She was not staying behind. Together they moved toward the ridge. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, not just from the fear of the unknown, but from the realization that Ahana had chosen to face it by his side. She was no longer just a silent presence in his cabin. She was a partner in the truest sense. As they crested the ridge, the raiders appeared, moving quickly along the tree line. Daniel aimed his rifle, but it was Ahana who first alerted him to a second group attempting to flank them. With surprising agility, she guided him, pointing out hidden paths and warning of loose snow patches. Each step revealed her skill, her knowledge of the land, and her courage. When the raiders finally spotted them, Daniel fired a warning shot. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. Ahana didn't flinch. Instead, she drew a small knife from her belt, standing ready to defend herself and him. For a moment, Daniel's heart pounded not just with fear, but with awe. This girl, this stranger, had become his equal in courage, willing to risk herself for him as much as he had risked for her. The raiders paused, wary of the unexpected resistance. Daniel felt a surge of hope. Together, he and Iona moved as one his, rifle covering their flanks, her agility and instincts keeping them one step ahead. It was not brute force alone that saved them, but the coordination and trust that had developed silently over weeks in the cabin. By the time the raiders retreated into the trees, Daniel was breathless, his hands shaking, but not from fear alone. He turned to Iona, who was crouched beside him, knife still in hand, her chest heaving from exertion. Her dark eyes met his, steady and unwavering, and in that moment he understood fully what her silent choice had meant. "You saved me," he said quietly, almost a whisper, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. She had saved him just as much, perhaps more. Iona's lips curved into a faint, proud smile, and she lowered the knife. No words were needed. The bond between them had been forged in fire and snow, in shared danger, in silent understanding. That night, back in the cabin, the fire seemed brighter, the walls warmer. Daniel watched her move about, tending the hearth as always, but now with a different weight to her steps. She was no longer merely a guest or a ward. She was a woman who had proven herself loyal, brave, and indispensable. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine the future, not just the days of isolation he had grown accustomed to, but a life with Iona by his side, equal in courage, strength, and heart. The snow outside may have melted, but the fire between them burned hotter than ever, solidified by trust, respect, and the silent promise they had made in that ridgetop encounter. Daniel realized then that this was no longer about obligation or tradition. This was about choice, hers and his, and the quiet truth that some bonds were forged not by law, not by custom, but by the courage to stand together when the world demanded it most. The morning after the raid, the cabin felt different. The wind had softened to a gentle whisper, and the mountains seemed almost peaceful, though Daniel knew better. Danger was never far in the high country, but for the first time he felt a sense of calm that wasn't born from isolation. It came from presence, Iona's presence. They moved around the cabin in practiced ease. Daniel chopped wood while she tidied the small room, her movements deliberate and confident. Something in the way she handled the chores, the fire, and even him seemed to fill the space with life he hadn't realized was missing. As he stacked the last split logs by the hearth, Daniel paused to watch her. She knelt near the fire, arranging herbs to dry, her dark hair catching the light. He felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest, a mixture of admiration, respect, and something far deeper. He thought back to the storm that had brought her to his door, the moment when he had offered her warmth without expecting anything in return. He remembered the whispers from the valley, the warning of tradition, the tension of strangers navigating a confined space. And now, after days of shared work, silent choices, and even facing danger together, he realized something undeniable. He was no longer indifferent. Iona turned at the sound of him shifting, and their eyes met. For a long moment neither spoke. Words felt inadequate and able to capture the depth of what he was feeling. Instead, he watched her expression, the way her dark eyes met his without fear, the faint curve of her lips suggesting trust, courage, and something more personal. Daniel's heart quickened. He understood then what he had been trying to avoid admitting. He cared for her deeply and irrevocably. It wasn't a fleeting attraction born from proximity. It was respect, admiration, and a dawning recognition that his life, once carefully ordered in solitude, had been irrevocably changed by her arrival. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking softly under his boots. "Ahiona," he began, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. She looked up at him, curious but patient. I've been thinking." She tilted her head slightly, the movement almost imperceptible but deliberate, a question in her gaze. "I thought I was alone here," he continued. "I thought I wanted only solitude, peace, and the quiet of these mountains. But—" His voice faltered for a moment as he struggled to find the right words. "But I can't imagine this place without you. Not just the cabin, but you, your presence, your courage, the way you've chosen to be here." Ahiona's eyes softened, and she placed her hand over her chest, mirroring the gesture she had made weeks before, the silent choice she had made. Long ago, it was an acknowledgement, not of obligation, but of intent. Daniel felt a weight lift from him, replaced by a warmth he had never known. The walls of the cabin seemed smaller now, but in a good way more intimate, more alive. He realized that the bond between them had grown naturally, forged through shared hardship, mutual respect, and quiet understanding. It was not tradition alone that bound them, it was choice, affection, and the realization that they were stronger together than apart. For the first time, Daniel spoke what he felt with clarity. "Ahiona, I want you to stay. Not because your people say you must, not because tradition demands it, but because I want you here, with me, if you will have me too." Ahiona's hand reached for his, resting lightly on top. Her touch was steady, confident, and full of meaning. No words were necessary. In that simple gesture, Daniel understood. She had made her choice long ago, quietly and deliberately. The fire crackled between them, a witness to their unspoken promise. Outside, the valley lay calm, the remnants of winter melting into the promise of spring. Inside, two hearts recognized each other, not by law or tradition, but by truth. Daniel finally allowed himself to smile. He had faced the storm, the snow, the world beyond the mountains, and he had found something more valuable than solitude. He had found Ahiona, and with her, the possibility of a life shared, chosen, and true. Spring had arrived in the mountains, though reluctantly. Patches of snow clung stubbornly to the shaded slopes, but the valleys below glimmered with fresh green, and the creek sang louder as it ran free from winter's hold. Daniel and Ahiona had settled into a new rhythm, each day weaving them closer. Together, the cabin no longer a refuge but a home. Despite their growing bond, Daniel knew there was one final step to honor, not only for Ahiona's people but for himself. Tradition, he had learned, could not be ignored, and while their hearts had chosen one another, acknowledgement from her tribe was a mark of respect he could not dismiss. He led Ahiona to the edge of the clearing, where the first signs of spring brushed the trees with soft green buds. They waited, the silence between them heavy with anticipation, until the riders arrived Ahiona's people. The elders among them, their faces grave but respectful. The leader, the elder who had first spoken to him weeks ago, dismounted with measured steps. He studied Daniel with a careful, appraising gaze. "You have honored her. You have kept her safe," he said, voice steady. "Now it is your choice. You may claim her because tradition binds you, or because your heart does." Daniel met Ahiona's eyes. She stood beside him, steady and composed, her hand brushing lightly against his. No words were needed. The silent choice she had made long ago resonated between them. He bowed his head slightly. "I claim her because my heart chooses her, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because I cannot imagine my life without her." The elders' stern expression softened just enough to reveal a hint of approval. He gestured toward Ahiona. "And you, child? Do you accept this choice freely?" Ahina stepped forward, her gaze meeting the elder's first, then Daniel's. She lifted her hand to his, intertwining their fingers. Her voice, steady and clear, carried across the small clearing. "I choose him." The words, simple and firm, were all that was needed. The elders nodded in unison, and the tension that had shadowed the mountains since that first blizzard lifted like mist under the morning sun. Tradition had been honored, but love, not duty, was the foundation of this. Union. Daniel felt a rush of warmth flood through him, a mixture of relief, joy, and reverence. He took Ahina's hand in both of his, feeling the strength of her grip, the certainty of her presence. "We will return," he said softly, "home, together." The ride back to the cabin was quiet, save for the soft crunch of hooves over thawing snow. Each moment reinforced the truth they both carried. This was no longer a story of rescue or obligation or tradition. It was a story of choice, of hearts intertwined, of two lives willingly joined against the backdrop of mountains that had witnessed their journey. At the cabin, they paused at the threshold. Daniel pulled the door open, and Ahina stepped inside first, surveying the space that had been a refuge, then a battleground of hearts, and now a home. He followed, closing the door behind them. The fire, still warm from earlier, seemed to burn brighter in acknowledgement. Daniel knelt beside Ahina, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You came to my door seeking warmth," he said softly, "and you stayed, not because you had to, but because you chose to. And now I choose you." Ahina's hand rested over his heart once more, and the moment stretched between them. Silent vow, a promise forged not by storm or snow, not by outsiders' whispers or tradition alone, but by two people who had found one another in the wild, in danger, and in quiet courage. As the evening settled over the mountains, the cabin held more than warmth. It held love, choice, and a bond neither winter nor tradition could break. Outside, the world stretched vast and indifferent, but inside, Daniel and Ahina faced it together, partners in life, in trust, and in heart. And so, the story that began with a desperate knock on a snowy night ended with a chosen marriage. Union of hearts that had weathered storms, danger, and doubt, and emerged stronger, ready to face all that the future could bring.